So it's essentially saying that the life of any startup is basically before product market fit and after product market fit, and that's really how I've found through, again, trial and error of these early stage startups is basically it changes the way you execute the business when you don't have product market fit. A great example is the process that PayPal went through to get to product market fit, and Dave came out of PayPal, so he can maybe fill in some of the gaps. So PayPal was originally funded as a cryptography product where Max Levchin looked at the way that people access servers securely, and they carried a bunch of dongles around, and it was a pretty inconvenient process, and so he decided he was going to create a secure way through a PDA to store that authentication information. It was an interesting enough opportunity that he raised a couple $100,000 on that, and but once he created the product and tried to get it out to people, he realized that people really didn't need the product. And so on that same $200,000, he actually developed a prototype for his next product, which was PDA payments. So once he realized that people didn't want that first product, then they basically said, what are we good at? We're good at developing for the PDA. We're good at security. What are some ways to use our strengths? And that's where they basically decided that they were going to do an e-wallet type concept. And you can see there that not too long after, over a period of time, they ultimately had 100 times more people that were actually using a web demo of the product than the actual product themselves. And so they sort of stumbled into that market that ultimately became the valuable business that they sold to eBay for $1.5 million. But I think the important lesson here is that if you don't have product market fit, you don't just sort of throw the towel in and say, oh, okay, we're screwed. You keep iterating, you keep getting that feedback from users until you have a product. And I think, especially if anybody's sort of heard stories about Max Levchin, that he's a super driven person who you would think would maybe be trying to force a product down people's throat, but he obviously had to be pretty responsive, and the company had to be pretty responsive through that. One other interesting note is the number of companies that are part of the PayPal mafia that came out of that. I think for people who actually saw that process and saw how you actually create a very valuable company. So you've got LinkedIn, Yelp, YouTube. Those are all former people that were inside PayPal. So how do you know if you have product market fit? I've created a survey with KISS metrics on a website called survey.io. It's a free template that if you use a different survey product, you can lift it from there. But there's one critical question that's on the survey, and it's how would you feel if you could no longer use this product? And I'm looking at the percentage of people that say they would be very disappointed without the product. And I've probably run this survey across 50 companies now, probably more at this point. And I've run it across the 9 companies that I've worked with in the last couple of years. And what I found is that if a company is sort of in the single digits or even 20% of their users saying that they'd be very disappointed without the product, I've had a really hard time growing that company. That it's trying to market a company like I've got one hand tied behind my back and I'm in a boxing match. I'm at a big disadvantage. Whereas if they're over 40% of the users saying that they'd be very disappointed, it's actually pretty easy to market those products. In fact, a company like Dropbox just they've hit 1 million users faster than any company that I work with on no marketing money, where previous companies we were spending a lot of marketing money. So once you have a great product, it doesn't necessarily market itself, but it makes it way easier to market. And so this, based on the levels that you're at, if you're in the 0 to 25%, you may have to do that initial type of iteration that PayPal went through, where it was a complete rethink of the business. If you're in the 26 to 39%, there may be a use case that works really well within your business, and you can kind of hone in on that. And then if you're above 40%, then it really changes the way that you operate the business, and that's where I would move up to the point where I start thinking about transitioning to growth and building a business around it. So when I think about transitioning to growth, the first thing I want to do is make sure that I've got all the metrics in place to optimize incoming traffic and to manage growth, and basically all of the key metrics that Dave talked about earlier. And I'll go through some specific details on how I use those. I want to make sure that the product is positioned, and when I'm doing positioning, I'm really looking at, okay, for those users who say that they would be very disappointed without it, why would they be very disappointed without it? What is it that they love about the product? And I'm trying to position on that attribute of the product. What's one thing that's kind of interesting on that, I did have one company that was only at a 7% of their users that said they'd be very disappointed without it. And we honed in on that 7% was all focused in on the exact same attribute. And we basically repositioned on that attribute. And in 1 week, the new cohort of users that came in responded to that same survey question at over 40% that said they'd be very disappointed. So
that suggests that taking features out can be very impactful in getting product market fit, right?
See, we didn't take them out. We just spoon-fed the features and sort of highlighted the attributes that
You made the features that people wanted front and center in the product. Is that what you did?
Yeah, exactly. And so we just didn't highlight them until we gratified people. Until basically you have a really brittle relationship on the acquisition process. And the number one reason why you lose people, the one that I found, is complexity. And pouring more features, and especially when on an engineering-driven company, a lot of times there's pride in all the work that they've done in all those features. And so you want to put them all front and center. But I think we would have had a hard time just A/B testing and iterating to figure out that was the set of features to highlight. And so I think this combination of surveying and really getting to know what users love about the product and then using that to drive some of your tests can really help things.
Sean, just to pick up on that, I mean, engineering, you're talking about how you bring engineering into marketing. How do you, I mean, what you're talking about is a very sort of customer-led perspective on how you sort of move a business forward. How do you get the engineering organization to buy into this process? Is it by having these objective surveys and metrics where it's like the numbers can't lie? You've got to get people to sort of sign up to that contract, or how do you sort of?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I think it's been track record of just having good companies, and then the way that I didn't really clarify how I work with a company, but when I come into a company, we form a team with the CEO, myself, and then a project manager, and we're basically saying, okay, the product is good enough. How do we build a business around this product? And so it's really CEO driven in terms of, so it's not that hard to convince the engineers when it's CEO driven. And the interesting thing is that as a marketer on the inside of a company, I would have never been able to push this stuff through. But now, as an outsider, I have a little more credibility. And then that's the last step is really the viable economics around the business. And it's interesting, but it's really, I use the same process as the positioning process of really understanding what is the core value that people are focused in on that would make them very disappointed not to have that product, and I make sure that my business model, that's why I have a hard time for people who kind of launch the business and know what their business model is and have everything priced up before they've kind of responded to seeing what people like about the product, because they may be sort of charging extra for things that people don't care about and giving away free stuff that people care about. And so by understanding where that core value is first and then layering a business model on top of that, I tend to find that you actually get a lot more effective business model. So this is just a little bit of the optimization process I go through. Sure.
Let's come back to that previous point. So how do you find out whether you're overpricing or underpricing? You're still starting with a price, right? It's not that you do everything like for free. Check what they respond to and then put a price on it.
Well, it depends on the business. If you have a business that has a really high marginal cost on the product, you might not be able to give it away early. My preference, and I've changed. A year ago, I was very focused on on charging from day one. In fact, that was in my contracts with people. But what I found is that early on, you get a lot of people that are in trials, and then you ask them that question: how would you feel if you could no longer use this product? And based on the conversion percentage, there's certain people that have already decided, I'm not going to pay for this product, therefore I would only be somewhat disappointed if I couldn't have it. So you just don't get as good of a read. So I just recently had a company where I did this exact process, that they were actually charging for the product. They didn't have very many transactions. I had them take the business model off, and we, along with some iterations, we quickly moved it from about a 25% very disappointed number to a 60%. And now I knew who the passionate people were.